1942, one of the bloodiest battles of World War II was fought on the idyllic island of Guadalcanal. Today, scattered around the shores of this island paradise, lie the grim remains of the savage conflict, discarded like so many toys. The guns are now silent. The men who fired them are gone. And many of the ships that brought them lie rusting and broken in the sea. Ben Krupp's expedition travels to the Solomon Islands and explores these historic relics. His journey leads him deep into the skeletons of ghostly ships and to the graveyards of the Sunken Warriors. Ben's expedition to the Solomon Islands starts in Australia's tropical north. On the way, they explore the wreck of the Ferguson, a British warship which struck the reef and sank in 1842. The ship was taking soldiers of the Queen's 50th Foot Regiment to reinforce the British garrison in India. Luckily, no one was lost in the wreck, and the soldiers went on their way in another ship. For most of them, though, it was only a reprieve. Of 750 men sent to India, 564 died in battle. Anything made of wood has rotted away. All that's left of the soldiers' guns are the musket balls and metal trigger guards. Crew member Wally Gibbons and Ben's wife, Lynn, find some uniquely historic relics buried in the coral. They're campaign buckles that would have been worn by the soldiers, and they carry the coat of arms of the 50th Regiment.
Hand me all your goodies up. Sounded a bit clean, doesn't it? Yeah, well, that's definite proof that it's a Ferguson 50th Regiment.
It's even got it on the buttons as well.
Yeah. See the Sphinx on here in Egypt? Well, this was really a campaign buckle, I suppose, worn across here on those cross straps, actually like
yes.
that. And that would be for the Battle of Nile in the 1790s that they were at. But the 50th Regiment was on its way to the Battle of Paniar in India. And most of them survived the shipwreck, but a few survived the battle. Only a very few. In fact, most of them lost their lives when the barracks fell on them. Anyway, you're probably wondering why Wally hasn't come back. Well, that's the reason. Found the coin. Yes, but it's not much. It's only a half crown. So
It's still a coin.
Lousy British ship.
Ben moves on, continuing his northward course. At another anchorage near a lonely coral cay, Ben crosses paths with two fishing trawlers. Like a Pied Piper, the trawlers always draw the sharks. In shallow water off Cape Grenville, the crew see their first wreck from the war years. It's an old RAAF P-39 Airacobra. This plane was on a mission out from Townsville, but the pilot lost his way in a storm and ditched it here when it ran out of fuel. There were 22 of these American aircraft in service with the RAAF. Unfortunately for their pilots, in a dogfight they were no match for the Japanese Zero. At Pandora entrance, on the far north of the Barrier Reef, Ben meets up with the government research vessel Lumen. With crew member Ron Bell on lookout, he guides the Lumen to one of the most historic shipwrecks in Australia.
Yeah. Well, I think we're right on it.
Marine archaeologists from the West Australian Museum are here to study the wreck of the HMS Pandora. Ben and Steve Dom discovered the wreck in 1977. The sharks have had the Pandora to themselves for nearly 200 years. She was en route to England in 1791 after arresting some mutineers in Tahiti. The men had taken part in the now famous mutiny on the Bounty. The scientists will study every inch of the wreck. It will be mapped and measured. Then a series of photographs will be taken to make up a photo mosaic. This is transferred to a map that shows the location of everything visible on the site. For the wreck is a time capsule of life at sea 2 centuries ago. The West Australian Museum concluded that the Pandora was the most important unexcavated wreck site in Australian waters. Ben received a reward of $5,000 from the federal government for his part in the discovery. Ben finds a mystery wreck next on the Sunken Warriors. Ben heads out into the Coral Sea on the next leg of his voyage to the Solomon Islands. These remote waters are not visited by ships very often. It's a maze of coral reefs. And Ben doesn't want to wind up like this Japanese long-line fishing boat. She went onto the reef in a storm in 1964. There's not much left on the boat. But Wally's found a few glass buoys that will come in handy later on for marking submerged wrecks. Every summer, devastating cyclones sweep through the whole area. When Ben came back 6 months later, the longliner had broken in two. Ben keeps a sharp lookout and checks his charts constantly. But he's very glad he didn't rely on them alone. Directly in Beaver's path is a large reef not marked on the chart at all. Ben has radar, sonar, and a depth sounder on board, as well as an experienced crew. Ships in the past might not have been quite as lucky. Ben rechecked his bearings to make sure he wasn't off course. But according to the chart, the reef just shouldn't be there.
Ron, this reef here, it's not on this chart. Now, this is the most modern chart, 1975, and I've had to mark this reef in, and this is a big one.
Yeah.
I've got it 2 3/4 miles just south of Boot Reef, but you know, we were going to run out here at night onto eastern fields. And just imagine if we did that. You know, we'd hit it. I think we should go in there, you know, look for some wrecks tomorrow morning. Beaver, Thursday Island Beaver, we have located a large uncharted reef in latitude 10 degrees.
The Navy Hydrographic Service agreed to name the new reef Beaver Reef, after Ben's boat. It looks as though an unlucky ship has found the reef before. It's an early 1800s design, and was obviously well armed. It could even have been a warship. But there are no signs of identification. Probably no one survived the wreck to tell of the ship's end. The wreck will just have to remain a mystery. Ben decides that he'd like to salvage one of the smaller cannon. The cannon is heavy and encrusted with coral, but Wally has a lot of experience. He used to be a professional salvager. The lifting bags are a very simple but effective device. Once they're securely tied to the object which has to be lifted, they are then filled with air. The laws of physics do the rest. Ben will later take the cannon to his shipwreck museum in Port Douglas. When it's cleaned up, it might even have some distinguishing marks that will help identify the mysterious wreck. Moving on, Ben passes the coast of Papua New Guinea. The locals here are very friendly. Next stop, the Solomon Islands. They were named after King Solomon because someone, quite wrongly, thought that there was a lot of gold here. Beaver passes a tiny sand cay called Kennedy Island. It looks insignificant, but it's an historic spot.
Len, have a look at this. This island here is Kennedy Island.
Named after John F. Kennedy?
Well, it was called Casola before the war, but Kennedy after the war. Just over here is Blackhead Strait, and that's where Kennedy's PT-109 was cut in half by the Japanese destroyer. But one half didn't sink, and they clung to that, and they drifted around here for quite a long time until they got very close to this island. And Kennedy and his men swam ashore, but they had a pretty tough time on the island. There's no fresh water. They had to catch the raindrops dripping off the leaves. So Kennedy swam over to this big island over here, and he found a native in a canoe who paddled right over and got word back to his base, and they sent a boat over to pick up his men.
If it hadn't been for this lucky chain of events, the course of world history could well have been changed. At Sunlight Passage in the Russell Group, Ben stops to look at some of the old torpedo boat bases. There's not much left but junk now. The pontoon wharves where the boats used to tie up have rusted through and sunk. Local islanders find the old base a good place to collect spider shells. The shells sell for a high price to tourists. The wooden piles that held the pontoons now play host to coral. But the real show goes on further down, especially at night. The water drops off quite deeply here, and at night, the coral at the reef edge comes alive with colour. Daytime fish like this hump-headed parrot sleep between the piles at night. That is, unless disturbed by a diver. A big cod is also bewildered by the light. All around, there are signs of the war. Hundreds of planes and ships were sunk around the islands during the war. And after it ended, vast amounts of ammunition and equipment were dumped in the sea, because it was too expensive to take home. These are old gas bottles that have been torn apart by explosions. There are some very odd creatures living in the coral. These are Crinoid feather starfish. They feed on plankton in the water. This could be a vacuum cleaner hose, but it's really a Synapta sea slug, about 2 meters long. The little squid is common all around the island, and cooked in the right way, they're very good to eat. Perhaps the weirdest creature here is the basket starfish. It looks like a plant, but it's really an animal. And though it's called a basket, it's not much good for carrying things in. Its tentacles cling to anything it touches, but it's harmless. And like the crinoids, it also feeds on plankton. Ben visits a famous PT boat base next on Sunken Warriors. Torpedo boat bases were built all around the maze of islands that make up the Florida group in the Solomons. The stories of day-to-day wartime life at this one on Gavatu were used for the television series McHale's Navy. In a sense, the base is famous. Occasionally, enemy ships or planes were captured and kept as spoils of war. Out in the bay are the remains of two such prizes now abandoned and forgotten. This was a Japanese flying boat used for reconnaissance. This is all that's left of an old supply barge. The capital of the Solomon Islands is Honiara, on the island of Guadalcanal. Just north of here is the wreck of a Japanese freighter. Its name isn't known, but the locals call it Banigatu because it's the second wreck close to the nearby river of that name. It's typical of the wrecks in the area. There are so many of them that after the war, the channel here was renamed Iron Bottom Sound. Ben and Lynn are eager to explore the old Sunken Warrior. The freighter was unloading supplies to Japanese troops on Guadalcanal when it was bombed by Allied planes. Her master beached her as a last desperate measure. The ship's cargo of ammunition litters the bottom. All the ammunition is still live, but must be handled carefully. Quite regularly, someone in the islands is injured by an exploding bomb or shell. Ben and the team are able to look at and touch these relics of the war as much as they like, but they are not allowed to salvage or remove anything. The war had a profound impact on the Solomon Islanders. For the first time, they were confronted with the awesome technology of the modern world. The relics of the war represent a turning point in their history. It's something they'll never forget. Just before Ben arrived here, the Solomon Islands government declared all war relics protected. The coral and other organisms established themselves very quickly on the wrecks. This vague shape is a tank that never made it to battle. Ben and the crew decide to try a night dive on the battered old freighter. Many creatures on the wreck only come out at night, so now is the time to see them. The lamp on Ben's camera brings out the brilliant colors in the coral. damp also brings out some of the fish. This hump-headed parrotfish uses the bump on its head to break up the coral and get at the food inside. It's a hard life when every time you want to feed you have to bash your head on a rock. Wally can approach the fish, but he must be careful not to startle it. A bump that can break up coral could easily damage the camera, or even worse, one of the divers. Hundreds of different creatures live in the wreck. Its endless nooks and crannies provide excellent protection from predators. One of the most exotic creatures in the wreck is the butterfly cod. It's certainly as graceful as a butterfly, but it doesn't have wings. It has spines, and they're very sharp and poisonous. Wally has handled the cod many times before. At night, the cod, like the parrotfish, is quiet and fairly docile. But all it takes is one wrong move.
How's the finger, Wal?
It hurts like hell.
That was bad luck. Yeah. Oh, Nurse Lily will fix it up.
Yeah, I hope she does something for it.
Well, the only remedy is put the finger in boiling water.
I don't know, we could amputate.
Looks like the bleeding's
Yeah, I'll go along with that.
Ben finds the mother sub which launched the attack on Sydney Harbour, next on Sunken Warriors. In early 1942, the Japanese army marched unopposed into the Solomon Islands and set up their base on the island of Guadalcanal. They now dominated the entire Western Pacific, and the next part of the plan was to launch an attack on Australia. The Allies, under American command, realized that the Japanese had to be stopped before they could go any further. The decision was taken. An all-out offensive was launched on Guadalcanal. In the following months, the battle for control of this small and peaceful island became the bloodiest in the whole of the Pacific War. When the smoke cleared, 26,000 men were dead. But the tide of the war had changed in favor of the Allies, and Japanese dreams of a Pacific empire quickly began to fade. Wrecks of war machines can be found all over the island. Some, like this American Hellcat, are displayed in people's gardens. Some, like this Corsair, are slowly being lost in the jungle. Still others, like this Japanese Zero, lie twisted at the bottom of the channel. In 1942, two Japanese midget submarines tried unsuccessfully to sink Allied warships in Sydney Harbour. This is the remains of the mother sub that launched those midgets. Here off Guadalcanal, the sub accidentally surfaced beside the New Zealand corvettes Moa and Kiwi. They were so close that the Moa skipper leant over and shot the submarine captain dead with a pistol. The corvettes riddled the sub with cannon fire until she ran aground on the reef, and then slid off and sank in 15 meters of water. So many ships and planes went down in the sea that often the only people who know where they sank are the local islanders.
We look about for one aeroplane stopped round here someplace. You savvy where now, Hms stop? Yes, Mr. Wally, I know where the plane stopped.
Oh, good now. Where?
Hms stop long behind point there.
Not far away?
Not very far, but close a little bit.
Time you go along canoe, can you look him long down inside along salt water?
Yes, not very deep too much, but a little bit.
A little bit, eh? Oh, all right, that sounds good. Okay, thank you too much.
Ain't got too much, Mr. Wally.
About a mile and a half, eh? That's not very far. Oh, we're pretty close to the spot.
It's the wreck of a B-17 Flying Fortress. Lying on the bottom in 12 meters of water, miraculously it's still in one piece. It must have crash-landed out here in very calm seas. As usual, the coral has crept quietly in, and the fish have taken up permanent residence. The gun turrets don't turn anymore, but they still manage to look menacing. Over the sandy flats near the wreck, the crew found hordes of very strange creatures. These are garden eels. They live on microorganisms in the water, and when they want to feed, they poke their heads out of their protective holes and let the current carry the food to them. In large numbers, they really do look like a garden. The American counter-offensive was launched here at Red Beach in August 1942. The objective was a then incomplete Japanese airfield. Surprisingly, the airfield was quickly taken, and the Americans worked frantically to complete it. Renamed Henderson Field, it was soon operational, and Allied aircraft started coming in with precious supplies. The enemy launched offensive after offensive against Henderson Field, but the Americans held doggedly on. The most terrible encounter of all was the Battle of Bloody Ridge in mid-September. Thanks to intelligence supplied by local islanders, the Americans placed their major defenses in exactly the same spot that the enemy chose to attack. In this exposed terrain, the Japanese force was cut to pieces. A monument, erected here by the Americans, commemorates the 2 nights of savage fighting that resulted in the defeat of the Japanese and the loss of so many lives. Nearby, a similar monument has been erected by the Japanese people.
That's a gun. Perhaps a machine gun.
Hey, what's that beside the old helmet?
Oh, it's a dog tag, Lynn.
Oh, it is too.
Can you read the name on that?
Oh, it's a bit hard.
There's a bit of a serial number there. Maybe we could pick out some of the letters.
Buffalo. So it is an American,
Buffalo,
for sure.
yeah, Buffalo, New York. He's American, all right.
Well, I think we should send it back, don't you?
Yeah, they'd know from the serial number who the person was.
Yeah.
The Solomon Islanders gave unfailing support to the Allies. Their ability to provide accurate intelligence probably made the difference between winning and losing on Guadalcanal. Some islanders, like Sir Jacob Vuza, became heroes whilst helping the Allied cause.
And where we stopped on day 2.
And they rescued you, the Americans.
Yeah.
But tell me, the Japanese, when they were torturing you, I believe they bayoneted you quite a few times, about 7 times.
Yes.
And where? In the neck?
Yeah, in neck.
Yeah? All of them in the neck?
Yeah.
And
tongue.
And tongue. And you survived that?
Yeah. And hand.
Yeah? And they must have thought you were dead?
Yeah.
And you crawled away and...
Yes, I just crawled away to go.
Yes, that's... Well, now you're a war hero. America regards you as a war hero.
Yeah.
And the English, because they knighted you.
Yeah. Now Japanese, I thought I'm died, but no more.
Ben finds a hidden destroyer next on Sunken Warriors. Ben now heads for the same place as this fishing boat. The Battle of Guadalcanal was nearly 40 years ago, and a whole new generation has grown up since then. On the island of Tulagi, Japanese fishermen have established a tuna canning industry that gives a lot of work to the local islanders. The cannery uses locally caught skipjack tuna. Across the bay lie the hulks of more recent Japanese ships. They're old tuna boats that have outlived their usefulness. The fishermen use school herring as bait to catch the tuna. Ironically, the herring at Tulagi use the old tuna boats as a sanctuary. Soon the Japanese might have some competition. The Solomon Islands government is building a fleet of boats to start an indigenous industry. Everywhere Ben goes, he seems to find rusting piles of junk left over from the war. Old wrecks seem to appear in the most unlikely places. Deep in a narrow cove among the mangroves near Tulagi is a complete Japanese destroyer, lying derelict in the shallows. The destroyer was captured by Allied torpedo boats and hidden in the cove. She was eventually forgotten and just rusted away. 10 years ago, Wally came here to salvage the destroyer. While he was away one day, his native crew accidentally sank his boat. And that's it, still lying alongside. About 2 kilometers from the destroyer, in Umboli Passage, is a place called Watering Point. With a name like that, it's not surprising that this is where Allied ships in the area used to take on supplies of fresh water. It comes from an underground river that runs through a cave in the hills. In 1943, United States Marines ran a pipe down from the cave, so the water was easier to get at. Ben has heard that the cave goes into the hillside for at least 1 kilometer, so he and the crew decide to explore it. Ben takes his underwater camera because the only way to explore the cave is to swim.
Watch your head on those stalactites.
You can't touch bottom, can you?
Nah.
The river has carved its way through the limestone rock, forming a series of large caverns that are separated by curtains of low stalactites. Those are the ones that hang from the ceiling.
I think I can walk now.
Everywhere there is dripping water, and no cave would be complete without them. Hundreds of bats living in the dark corners.
There's a prawn.
Oh, there's 2. Look at his eyes.
Funny looking things. Let's see if we can get him.
They move fast, don't they?
Yeah.
These large shrimps also inhabit the cave. They're very good eating, but hard to catch. Lynn finds another resident. It's a kind of scorpion called a phrynis.
Scorpion.
Its long feelers are adapted for its life in the dark cave. Lynn is careful with it, because she's not sure if her long-feelered friend is really dangerous. Ben now stops at Bairoki Harbour in the New Georgia group. The twin masts sticking out of the water belong to another casualty of the war. It's a Japanese freighter that was surprised by an Allied bombing raid while unloading its cargo of ammunition. The ship sank at its mooring, but now it makes a good mooring for beaver. freighter didn't have much of a chance. Ben and the crew are going to take a look. Giant rays cruise over the wreck as if escorting the divers in. An olive-brown sea snake is curious. In contrast to its stark fate, the wreck is one of the most alive that Ben and Lynn have seen. There's a dazzling display of marine life here. And a 100-kilo groper. Some of the ship's cargo looks strange in the water, like this truck. Lynn almost expected the horn to toot. The ship was also carrying shells for the big siege guns on shore. The guns took a heavy toll of Allied shipping in the nearby strait. The shells are still live, but Wally has had a lot of experience handling them. Diving on a wreck like this can be an eerie experience. Deeper into the ship it gets darker, and the shadows get longer. Wally can explore the wreck and look at the relics, but he can't take them away. Everything is protected by the government decree. With a wreck so full of life like this one, it's almost possible to forget that violence and death put the ship here in the first place. The team discover and explode live ammunition next on Sunken Warriors. Having had their first dive on the wreck, Ben wants to look for the live ammunition dump that was left behind by the Japanese.
Here, Lynn. Big pile of them. Yeah. Been here for ages. These are the warheads for those 75mm guns up on the next point. They're fully primed, ready to go, but they won't go off now. But still, if a fire swept through, you know, they would really burst.
What's Wally up to? Wally, what are you doing? You're going to blow yourself up.
I'm going to knock the heads out, deloud them, because some of them later will probably light a fire me, and then they'll blow themselves up.
But isn't it dangerous to do that?
It's not if you know what you're doing, isn't it?
Well, you may know, but I'll just watch them over
you
here.
watch them over there.
The ammunition is much too dangerous to be left lying around. If Wally didn't have his years of experience in salvage and demolition, it would be even too dangerous to touch.
That's the cordite that's out of it. Dry as a bone too, eh? The primer will probably go off on this one. I'll give it a clout and see.
Is it safe now?
Another one here I've got to do yet. Len, come over here. I'm going to burn this stuff. It's the only way to get rid of it. You'd be better off if you're behind me.
It won't explode.
No, it won't explode. It just burns. Or it should burn. It's very hot, isn't it?
I think I got sunburn.
You ready, Lynn?
Yeah, let's get my tank on.
Okay. need you to help me with this camera a bit, I think. Wally's gone. He'll wait for us down there.
Ready?
Yeah.
Ben's powerful lamp is essential for filming at night underwater. But if anything went wrong with the 110-volt power cable, the crew would wind up with deep-fried Ben. An earth leakage protection circuit is used for safety.
Lamp on.
Okay.
There she's on. Ready?
Okay.
Trina,
Yes?
8:16. You write that down?
Okay.
Nearly forgot.
The wreck at night is a completely different place. Old friends like the squid take on different colors. There are always new fish, or ones you haven't seen before. There are others that the team already knows well. The lamp disorients the fish. This one can't see where it's going. And this fellow can't work out which way is up. The butterfly cod is out again. But Wally stays at a respectful distance. The marine life on the wreck at night is even more luxuriant than it is during the day. There's even a strange parrotfish that sleeps in a protective bag of mucus. The wreck is eerie during the day, but it's even more unsettling at night. There are a lot more odd creatures about. Though it's not the things you can see that are the worry. It's the things you can only sense. Sometimes there's an odd feeling that you can't describe. Like when Lynn picked up these dinner plates. She started to wonder what had happened to the men who ate from them. And then grew cold at the thought. It's difficult to shut out thoughts of the war when reminders are all around you. Away from the bright coral near the surface, the wartime junkyard becomes brown and desolate. The deeper the team gets into the wreck, the more they feel that they're intruding. The feeling is strongest in the deepest recesses of the ship. Wally is diving where no one has been before. The door he's prizing open looks as though it's been sealed since the day the ship went down. Wally decides to let the unfortunate victim rest in his watery tomb.
Oh, that was good.
Yeah, you see that skull in there?
Yeah, that was weird, Wally. How come it's still there?
Oh.
I would have thought it had been eaten or something by
With the
now.
door closed like that, it's like a tomb, see? The microorganisms can't get at it.
Oh, I see.
Probably find the rest of them in their turf around.
The sunken warriors that Ben and his crew have explored are slowly being buried in the sea. When the last one eventually disappears, the sad memories of the war will hopefully become just another bad dream.